Picture the desert at dusk, when the light turns liquid and the world holds its breath. The sun descends toward the horizon, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of amber, rose, and blood. Shadows lengthen across the carved facades, filling ancient doorways with darkness, as if the stone itself is exhaling the heat of the day. The wind moves through the canyon soft at first, then insistent, carrying with it the whisper of centuries. This is Petra, the rose-red city. Half as old as time, the poet once wrote, and there are moments, standing before these monumental faces carved into living rock, when that feels less like poetry and more like truth. But beneath the beauty lies a question that has haunted archaeologists, historians, and wanderers for 200 years. Who were the people who built this place? Not merely built it, became it, fusing their identity so completely with stone and wind that when they vanished, they left behind only silence and shadow. The Nabataeans. The name sounds ancient, foreign, conjuring images of caravans and incense smoke drifting across starlit dunes. Yet for all their architectural grandeur, for all the wealth that once flowed through these canyons like water, the Nabataeans remain elusive, ghosts in their own city. A civilization that carved mountains but left almost no words. An empire that controlled the trade routes of the ancient world, yet disappeared so completely that for over 1,000 years, Petra itself was forgotten, a secret kept by desert tribes in sandstorms. How does a people accomplish the impossible, engineering water in the wasteland, building temples that speak to the stars, creating beauty that endures millennia, and then fades so utterly that even their stories turn to dust? The wind through the sick offers no answers, only more questions, whispered in a language we've forgotten how to hear. For over a millennium, Petra slept beneath the notice of the Western world. European maps showed blank spaces where the Rose City stood, and the few travelers who ventured into the hostile Jordanian desert returned with tales dismissed as fantasy, if they returned at all. The Bedouin knew, of course. They had always known. But their knowledge was guarded, protected by silence and the inhospitable landscape that surrounded the hidden valleys. Then, in August of 1812, a young Swiss explorer arrived in the region. His name was Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, though he traveled disguised as an Arab merchant, speaking fluent Arabic, and claiming to be on a pilgrimage to the tomb of Aaron, said to rest atop Mount Hor. The local guides were suspicious, but agreed to lead him through the narrow canyon they called the Sick. What Burckhardt saw that day would reshape the Western understanding of the ancient world. The gorge narrowed until the sky became a ribbon of blue overhead, the sandstone walls pressing close on either side. Then, suddenly, the rock opened, and through the gap blazed the facade of a temple unlike anything in the classical world he knew, towering columns, carved pediments, doorways that led into mountain hearts. All of it the color of sunset, even in morning light. He spent only a day in the hidden city, sketching what he could, aware that lingering might expose his deception. But when his journals reached Europe, they ignited a sensation. The lost city had been found. Petra, capital of a people called Nabataeans, mentioned briefly in ancient texts, but never fully explained, now stood revealed as a wonder of the ancient world. Yet rediscovery brought new mysteries. Who had carved these facades? When and for what purpose? And perhaps most haunting, why had such magnificence been abandoned, left to the wind and the scorpions and the forgetting sands? Burckhardt himself never returned. He died 5 years later in Cairo, still a young man, his greatest discovery barely explored. But the questions he awakened continued to echo through the stone corridors of Petra, unanswered still. Long before they became builders, the Nabataeans were wanderers. In the centuries before the Common Era, they emerged from the vast emptiness of the Arabian Peninsula nomadic traders who understood that survival in the desert required more than endurance. It demanded transformation. Where others saw wasteland, the Nabataeans saw possibility. where armies marched along visible roads. Announcing their presence with dust clouds and banners, the Nabataeans moved like water, following routes invisible to outsiders, paths known only through inherited knowledge and celestial navigation. They were masters of concealment, of adaptation, of reading the desert as sailors read the sea. Their genius lay not in conquest, but in connection. They understood that the tribes and kingdoms scattered across Arabia, the Levant, and beyond needed things they could not produce themselves. Incense from the south, silk from the east, wine and olive oil from the Mediterranean coast. The Nabataeans became the living thread that stitched together the ancient world's economy, and in doing so, they accumulated wealth that would eventually allow them to settle, to build, to carve their vision into the mountains themselves. But even as they settled, they never forgot the lessons of the nomadic life. Their cities, Petra chief among them, were fortresses disguised as art. The approaches were narrow, defensible, invisible from a distance. Inside, they engineered systems of water collection and storage, so sophisticated that a city could survive siege or drought for months, perhaps years. Cisterns hidden in rock, channels carved to catch every drop of rare rain, dams and reservoirs that turned flash floods from destroyer into sustainer. The desert taught them that water was life, and they learned the lesson so well they could make gardens bloom in stone. This was their revolution. They didn't conquer the desert. They convinced it to share its secrets. And in those secrets lay the foundation of an empire that would, for centuries, make the impossible routine. Imagine standing at the crossroads of the ancient world, where all the luxuries of civilization must pass through your hands. This was the position the Nabataeans claimed and defended for over 4 centuries, controlling the trade routes that connected Arabia Felix, the Blessed Arabia, with the markets of Gaza, Damascus, and beyond. The cargo that moved through their territory was more valuable than gold. Frankincense and myrrh, resins harvested from trees that grew only in the remote southern reaches of Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were essential to the religious and social life of the entire ancient world. Without frankincense, Roman temples could not honor their gods. Without myrrh, Egyptian embalmers could not preserve their dead. The demand was insatiable, and the supply was controlled by those who could navigate the brutal desert crossing from south to north. The Nabataeans charged for safe passage. They provided water, protection, and rest stops at calculated intervals along routes that could take months to traverse. Caravans of hundreds of camels moved through their territory, laden with precious cargo, and at each way station, a portion of the wealth changed hands. Some paid in coin, others in goods. All paid because the alternative was death from thirst, from bandits, or from simply losing the way in a landscape that offered no forgiveness. But the Nabataeans were more than mere toll collectors. They added value. They knew which markets commanded the highest prices. They understood seasonal demand, political shifts, the outbreak of war, or plague in distant cities. They became information brokers as much as trade facilitators, and this knowledge made them indispensable. The wealth flowed into Petra and other Nabataean cities like water into their famous cisterns, and like water, it was stored, accumulated, transformed into architectural wonder. The tombs and temples carved into Petra's cliffs were advertisements, declarations in stone. We are here. We are powerful. We control what you need. Yet there was fragility in this power, as the Nabataeans surely knew. Their empire was built not on land conquered, but on routes controlled, on services provided. Should those routes shift? Should the demand change? Should a rival power decide the price of passage was too high? Then what? Then the wealth would cease to flow, and the stone monuments would remain as testament to a prosperity that proved, in the end, as transient as morning mist in the desert sun. The question was never if the trade routes would change, only when. There are places on Earth where geology becomes poetry, where the raw materials of the planet's sandstone, iron oxide, Millennia of pressure and erosion combine to create something that transcends mere beauty and approaches the sublime. Petra is such a place. The stone from which the city is carved is Nubian sandstone, laid down in ancient seabeds over 200 million years ago. Iron minerals within the rock oxidized over geological ages, creating a palette that shifts from pale cream to deep crimson, depending on the concentration of iron and the angle of light. The result is a city that changes throughout the day, a living canvas where time itself becomes visible. At dawn, the facades glow soft pink, as if lit from within. Shadows pool in the recesses of carved columns and doorways, giving depth and dimension to surfaces that might otherwise seem flat. As the sun climbs, the colors intensify: orange, amber, rust, the deep red that gave the city its famous epithet. By midday, under the harsh desert sun, some sections bleach almost white, while others darken to burgundy. And at dusk, the cycle reverses, the stone seeming to hold the day's light even as darkness claims the sky. The Nabataean builders understood this. They carved with the light in mind, orienting facades to catch the sun at specific times, creating plays of shadow and illumination that emphasized architectural features and perhaps held symbolic meaning we can only guess at. The most famous structure, the Treasury, faces east, so that morning light floods across its elaborately carved surface, making the 6 massive columns seem to glow as if forged from the sun itself. But Petra is more than a single monument. It is a city of facades, hundreds of them, ranging from simple cave dwellings to elaborate temple tombs that rise dozens of meters up sheer cliff faces. Some are Hellenistic in style, with Greek columns and pediments. Others blend influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Arabia into something uniquely Nabataean. And throughout, the stone itself is the medium not built upon, but revealed, as if the sculptors believed the architecture already existed within the mountain and needed only to be freed. Walking through Petra, one senses that the Nabataeans were not simply building a city. They were creating a theological statement in stone, an argument about permanence and beauty, about human will imposing order on the chaos of nature. The desert erodes everything, given time. But here, they seem to say, we will make something so beautiful that even erosion becomes part of the design. The weathering of the stone adding character rather than destruction. Light and stone, united in a conversation that has continued for 2,000 years. Beauty alone does not sustain life in the desert. Beneath Petra's aesthetic grandeur lies an engineering achievement that rivals anything accomplished by Rome or any other ancient civilization. The Nabataeans made water abundant where nature provided almost none. The region around Petra receives perhaps 10 centimeters of rain annually, almost all of it during brief winter storms. For most of the year, the wadis, the dry riverbeds, are bone dry, lifeless arteries waiting for the rare pulse of a flash flood. Such an environment seems hostile to permanent settlement, let alone a thriving city of 20,000 or more inhabitants. Yet the Nabataeans saw the challenge differently. Rain was scarce, yes, but it did come. The question was not how to find water, but how to capture and keep every precious drop that fell. Some of these storage chambers could hold hundreds of cubic meters of water, enough to supply the city for months if properly managed. Ceramic pipes, some of them pressure-bearing, carried water to public fountains, private homes, and temples. The pipes were sectioned and fitted together with such precision that minimal leakage occurred. Remarkable feat considering the technology available. Yet questions remain. Some of the oldest water channels show such mastery that they seem almost too sophisticated to be early experiments. Did the Nabataeans learn from someone else? Were there earlier peoples in this region, desert engineers whose knowledge was adopted and adapted by the newcomers? The archaeological record is frustratingly incomplete, but traces exist older settlements beneath Nabataean layers, primitive but showing awareness of water management principles. What seems certain is this: without solving the problem of water, Petra could never have existed. The monuments speak of wealth and artistic vision, but the cisterns and channels speak of something more fundamental: human ingenuity applied to an environment that should, by all logic, have remained uninhabitable. The Nabataeans didn't just survive the desert, they made it bloom. Among the many mysteries surrounding the Nabataeans, perhaps none is more poignant than their silence. This was a literate civilization. They wrote, they kept records, they carved inscriptions on tombs and public monuments. Yet the voice of their culture, the stories they told themselves about who they were and where they came from, has been almost entirely lost. The Nabataean alphabet was an evolution of Aramaic script, adapted to write their own language, a form of Arabic that represented one of the earliest written versions of that language family. Hundreds of inscriptions survive, carved into stone or written on pottery, papyrus, and metal. But the vast majority are brief, prosaic dedications to gods, markers of ownership, records of construction, declarations of safe passage granted or payment received. Where are the histories, the poems, the theological treatises or philosophical discourses? Where are the stories of their heroes, the legends of their origins, the myths that surely existed to explain the relationship between their people and the harsh but beautiful land they inhabited? Other ancient civilizations left libraries, clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, carved stele recording their deeds and beliefs. The Nabataeans, despite their obvious sophistication, left almost nothing. Some scholars suggest that much of Nabataean literature was written on perishable materials: parchment, papyrus, leather that simply didn't survive the centuries. The climate around Petra, while arid, experiences enough humidity and temperature fluctuation that organic materials deteriorate relatively quickly compared to, say, the ultra-dry conditions of Egypt, where papyri can survive millennia. Perhaps vast libraries existed and simply crumbled to dust. There's another possibility, more unsettling. Perhaps much of Nabataean literature was deliberately destroyed. After the Roman annexation, as Christianity spread through the region, pagan texts were often targeted for destruction. What remains is the script itself: elegant, flowing characters carved into the walls of tombs, telling us names and dates, but little else. Reading these inscriptions, one senses the presence of the people who made them, but it's like hearing a conversation from another room. You know someone is speaking, but you cannot make out the words. The Nabataean alphabet would have its revenge on oblivion, though. It evolved, was adopted by Arabic speakers, and eventually transformed into the script used to write classical Arabic and, by extension, the Quran. Every Arabic text written today carries within it the ghost of Nabataean writing, a continuity the original scribes could never have imagined. Their language faded, but the shapes of their letters endure, carrying meanings they never intended, in a world they would not recognize. Whether this counts as survival or simply a different kind of erasure, we are left to judge for ourselves. In the heart of Petra, high in the cliffsides and in sanctuaries carved into remote mountain peaks. The Nabataeans worshipped deities who reflected the world they inhabited, powerful, mysterious, intimately connected to the earth and sky. Chief among these was Dushara, whose name means he of the Shara, referring to the mountain range that surrounds Petra. Dushara was a god of mountains and storms of sudden rain and life-giving water, and perhaps, most significantly, he was represented not by a human figure, but by a simple geometric form, a rectangular block of dark stone, uncarved, unadorned. The divine made physical, not through artistic representation, but through the raw material of the earth itself. These sacred stones, called beetles, were found throughout Nabataean territory. Some were portable, carried by traders on their journeys. Others were massive, installed in temples and high places, anointed with oils, venerated with sacrifices. The practice was ancient, predating the Nabataeans themselves, rooted perhaps in the very origins of human religious consciousness, the recognition of divinity in the earth, in the stone that endures when flesh cannot. Beside Dushara stood Al-Yuza, the Mighty One, a goddess associated with the morning star Venus. She represented fertility, protection, and the mysterious power of femininity that creates and sustains life. Some scholars identify her with earlier Arabian goddesses, suggesting continuity of worship stretching back centuries before Petra rose. She received offerings of incense, wine, and precious metals, her cult centers scattered across Nabataean lands. But the Nabataean pantheon was never purely Arabian. As their trade network expanded, they absorbed religious influences from every culture they contacted. Greek deities appear in their inscriptions. Zeus merged with Dushara, Aphrodite with Al-Yuza. Egyptian motifs decorate their temples. Mesopotamian symbols appear carved beside Arabian ones. The result was a religious syncretism that reflected their commercial identity. They were mediators, translators, synthesizers who could move between cultures, adopting what served them while maintaining their core identity. The high places, mountain peaks, where sacred rituals were performed, reveal much about Nabataean spirituality. These sites often feature carved basins for ritual washing, altars for sacrifice, and channels that might have carried water, or, some theorize, symbolic representations of water, acknowledging the life-giving power of what was so scarce in their world. Reaching these high places required physical effort, a pilgrimage of sorts, suggesting that worship was meant to be an active engagement with the divine rather than passive reception. Yet for all the physical evidence, temples, altars, carved inscriptions, the inner meaning of Nabataean religion remains elusive. What prayers did they speak? What myths explained the relationship between Dushara and Al-Yuza? What happened to the soul after death? And did the elaborate tombs represent more than just displays of wealth? Did they believe in an afterlife, reincarnation, or simply in the eternal sleep of stone? The gods they worshipped have been silent for 2,000 years. The stones remain, weathered and inscrutable, holding their secrets as firmly as the cliffs hold the carved facades. If divinity was truly present in those dark batals, in those mountaintop sanctuaries, it has not chosen to speak to those who come seeking answers now. Perhaps silence is itself a form of holiness. Perhaps the gods of stone prefer mystery to revelation. Among the travelers who recorded their journeys through Petra in antiquity, several mentioned a phenomenon that seemed to them magical, even supernatural. The cliffs sang, not metaphorically, literally. When wind moved through the narrow passages of the Sikh, through certain canyons and past specific rock formations, sounds emerged that seemed to have no natural source. Low moans that rose and fell, high-pitched whistles that echoed off sandstone walls. Sometimes travelers claimed the sound resembled human voices, chanting in languages no one could identify. The Bedouin who lived in the region knew these sounds well. They had stories about them, spirits trapped in stone, ancient priests still performing their rituals, the earth itself dreaming aloud. Most dismissed such tales as superstition, the usual human tendency to ascribe agency to phenomena not immediately understood. Then, in the late 20th century, physicists and acoustical engineers turned their attention to Petra. What they discovered confirmed what the ancients had reported. Certain geological formations within and around the city create powerful acoustic effects. Narrow passages focus and amplify wind sounds. Rock faces angled at specific degrees create interference patterns that generate standing waves. The result is a natural sound system of remarkable complexity, capable of producing tones that range from subsonic rumbles to frequencies at the edge of human hearing. More intriguing still, some of the carved spaces in Petra, particularly certain tomb chambers and the theater show acoustic properties that seem deliberately engineered. Sounds produced at specific locations within these spaces are amplified and carried in ways that enhance clarity and volume. A voice speaking from the central altar of a temple can be heard clearly throughout the chamber, while ambient noise from outside is dampened. Was this intentional? Did the Nabataeans understand acoustic principles well enough to design spaces that would enhance ritual speech or music? Or were they simply fortunate, carving spaces that happened to have favorable acoustic properties? We cannot know for certain. But one detail suggests deliberation. The most acoustically sophisticated spaces are religious in nature. The places where priests would speak, where prayers would be offered, where the words of ritual would need to reach assembled worshippers. These are the places that show the most refined acoustic engineering. Perhaps the cliffs did sing, in a sense. Perhaps the Nabataeans learned to make them sing, understanding that mystery and wonder were enhanced when the very stones seemed to participate in worship, when the mountain itself became a voice in the liturgy. The wind still moves through the sick today, and if you listen carefully at the right times, in the right places, you can still hear it, the echo of something ancient, something that might be geology or might be memory. Impossible now to distinguish one from the other. For decades, archaeologists exploring Petra and the surrounding region faced a fundamental limitation. They could only study what was visible. Structures buried beneath sand and debris, roads obscured by centuries of erosion, settlements hidden in remote valleys, all remained invisible, their secrets preserved by the very landscape that had swallowed them. Then came the satellites. Beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating into the 21st, remote sensing technology revolutionized archaeology. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping tools that could see through vegetation and beneath soil began revealing a hidden world that suggested the Nabataean kingdom was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Roads emerged from the data, entire networks of them, connecting Petra not just to obvious destinations like the Red Sea and Damascus, but to dozens of smaller sites scattered across the desert. Some followed wadis and natural routes. Others crossed apparently empty expanses, suggesting way stations now completely buried. The precision of these routes spoke to sophisticated surveying and planning. This was not organic development but engineered infrastructure, designed to facilitate rapid movement and communication across hostile terrain. Cisterns and reservoirs appeared in the satellite scans, hundreds of them, many far from any known settlement. These were not just storage facilities for local use, but part of a vast water management system that allowed caravans to cross the desert in stages, never more than a day's journey from water. The investment in infrastructure this represented was staggering millions of hours of labor carving rock, building channels, maintaining systems across thousands of square kilometers. Perhaps most intriguingly, the imaging revealed structures that don't fit the known pattern of Nabataean architecture. Circular formations, too regular to be natural, but unlike any building style documented in Petra. Rectangular enclosures in remote locations, their purpose unclear. And beneath known Nabataean sites, older layers suggesting earlier occupation, previous civilizations about which almost nothing is known. The picture emerging from this technological archaeology is of a landscape densely inhabited and heavily modified by human activity, far more so than the visible ruins suggest. Petra wasn't an isolated city-state, but the capital of a true kingdom, one that controlled and shaped vast territories through engineering and organization that rivals modern efforts. Yet with each new discovery comes new questions. Who built the circular structures? What were they for? The earlier layers beneath Nabataean sites, were these peoples conquered, absorbed, or did they simply fade away, leaving their infrastructure to be adopted by newcomers? And most haunting, how much remains still hidden, buried under dunes and debris, waiting for the next generation of technology to reveal it. The desert, it seems, is not empty. It is a palimpsest, layer upon layer of human endeavor, most of it still unread. The Nabataeans were masters of this landscape, but increasingly, it appears they were not the first masters, nor perhaps the most mysterious. They left monuments we can see, but beneath those monuments lie shadows we are only beginning to perceive. Stand in Petra at the moment of winter solstice sunrise. Position yourself at the entrance to the Monastery Adir, the massive temple carved high in the cliffs above the city center, and watch. As the sun breaks the horizon, light floods through the doorway, illuminating the interior chamber with golden radiance. The effect lasts only minutes before the angle shifts and shadow returns. But in those minutes, the stone seems alive, transfigured by light into something beyond mere architecture. Coincidence? Perhaps the monastery faces generally east, and all east-facing structures will receive morning light. But the precision of the alignment, the way the doorway frames the rising sun at a specific time of year, suggests intentionality. The Nabataeans, like most ancient civilizations, were observers of the sky. They traveled by stars, timed their caravans by the movements of celestial bodies, understood that the heavens offered a calendar more reliable than any human record-keeping. Other structures in Petra show similar alignments. Al-Khazna, the Treasury, while not precisely oriented to the solstice, faces east in a way that maximizes morning light during the equinoxes. The high places, those mountaintop sanctuaries, often provide clear views of the horizon, ideal for tracking the rising and setting positions of sun and stars throughout the year. And some researchers have noted that certain carved niches and openings seem designed to capture light at specific times, creating dramatic effects that would have been interpretable as divine signs or confirmations. Was this astronomy or astrology? Science or religion? For the ancients, such distinctions were meaningless. The movements of celestial bodies were facts of nature and expressions of divine will simultaneously. To track the stars was to understand the intentions of the gods. To align a temple with the solstice was to ensure that the sacred space resonated with cosmic order. The evidence grows more intriguing when compared with other ancient sites. Petra's astronomical alignments, if deliberate, placed the Nabataeans in the company of the Egyptians with their pyramid alignments, the Babylonians with their mathematical astronomy, the Maya with their elaborate calendars. This was sophisticated knowledge, requiring generations of observation and record-keeping. But here again, the absence of written records frustrates. Did the Nabataeans have astronomical texts? Tables predicting eclipses and planetary movements? We know they traded with cultures that did. The Greeks were developing astronomical theory during the Nabataean period. The Babylonians had centuries of observational data. It would be strange if such knowledge didn't flow along the same routes as frankincense and silk. Some alternative researchers go further, suggesting that Petra's layout reflects not just solar alignments, but stellar one-specific temples oriented toward the rising of Sirius, the star that marked the beginning of the Egyptian calendar, or toward points on the horizon where certain constellations rose at significant times of year. If true, this would indicate a level of astronomical sophistication equal to any civilization of the period. Mainstream archaeology remains cautious. Proving intentional alignment requires ruling out coincidence. And when dealing with structures carved over centuries, evolving in design and purpose, that proof can be elusive. Many apparent alignments might be the result of topography. You carve where the rock allows, and sometimes that happens to line up with celestial events. Yet standing in those spaces at those moments, winter solstice at the monastery, spring equinox at Al-Khazna, it's hard to dismiss the feeling that something deliberate is occurring. The light transforms the stone in ways that seem too perfect to be accidental. And if the Nabataeans were indeed the masters of their environment, that all evidence suggests, why would they not master the sky as well, incorporating its movements into their architecture, making their city not just a reflection of human power, but a mirror of the cosmos itself? The question remains open. The stars continue their eternal movements, and Petra's stones, oriented toward horizons they have watched for 2,000 years, keep whatever secrets their builders carved into their angles and alignments. The year 106 of the Common Era marks a transformation in Nabataean history. Yet it arrived not with the clash of armies, but with the bureaucratic efficiency of empire. Rome, having expanded its dominion across the Mediterranean and deep into the Near East, turned its attention to the remaining independent kingdom in the region, Nabataea. The circumstances are frustratingly unclear. No great battle is recorded. No siege of Petra, no desperate last stand of Nabataean forces against Roman legions. Instead, the sources speak of annexation, absorption, the kingdom becoming the Roman province of Arabia Petrea, with such smoothness that historians debate whether it was conquest or negotiation. Some accounts suggest the last Nabataean king, Rabel II, died without clear succession, providing Rome with a legal pretext to claim the territory. Others hint at diplomatic maneuvering, possibly years in the making, where Rome gradually increased its influence until formal annexation was merely the acknowledgement of an existing reality. Still others propose that the Nabataean elite, facing economic challenges as trade routes shifted and Rome tightened control over neighboring regions, saw annexation as preferable to isolation and decline. What seems certain is that Rome desired the territory not for conquest as glory, but for strategic and economic reasons. The Nabataean road system was valuable. It could move not just trade goods, but Roman legions across the desert rapidly. The water management systems were impressive enough to attract Roman engineering interest. And control of the incense routes, even if they were declining in importance, still represented significant revenue. For the Nabataean people, annexation brought changes that must have felt both subtle and profound. The king was gone, replaced by a Roman governor. Tax collection became more systematic, more relentless. Latin inscriptions began appearing alongside Nabataean script. Military veterans from other parts of the empire settled in the region, bringing foreign languages and customs. Yet Petra itself continued, at least for a time. The city still functioned, still traded, still maintained its distinctive character. Temples to Nabataean gods remained open, though increasingly they shared space with cults imported from Rome. The local elite, those who adapted quickly to the new order, found ways to prosper under Roman rule. For the common people, life might have changed little in the immediate aftermath. The same water still flowed through the same channels. The same crops grew in the same terraced gardens. But slowly, inexorably, the center of gravity shifted. New roads bypassed Petra, carrying traffic directly to ports on the Mediterranean coast. The incense trade, facing competition from maritime routes that could move goods faster and cheaper, declined. And as Petra's economic importance faded, so did its population. The wealthy moved to cities where opportunities beckoned. The poor followed, seeking work. The city that had thrived for centuries on being the indispensable crossroads began to experience what all crossroads fear: irrelevance. By the 4th century, Petra was a shadow of its former self. Earthquakes, always a threat in the geologically active region, damaged structures that were no longer priorities for repair. The elaborate water system, requiring constant maintenance, began to fail as the engineering knowledge and institutional organization necessary for its upkeep eroded. Eventually, the city that had defied the desert for so long surrendered to it, as population dwindled to a few scattered inhabitants, and the silence of abandonment crept through the carved canyons. Rome absorbed Nabatea, but in the end, the annexation felt less like conquest than entropy. The civilization didn't fall, it faded its distinctive identity, slowly dissolving into the broader Roman culture, then into Byzantine Christianity, then into Islamic Arabia, each transformation erasing a bit more of what had made the Nabataeans unique, until finally, only the stones remained mute testimony to a people who had briefly made the impossible routine. The invasion was silent because it didn't need to be loud. Time and economics accomplished what armies might have struggled to achieve. Here the narrative turns speculative, entering territory where evidence grows thin and interpretation becomes as much art as science. Yet the questions persist, nagging at the edges of the established historical record, refusing to be dismissed entirely. The Nabataean water management system at Petra is by any measure a marvel of ancient engineering. But some researchers, examining the oldest components of that system, have noted something puzzling. The earliest channels and cisterns show a level of sophistication that seems inconsistent with early experimental efforts. They work too well, demonstrate understanding of principles that should have taken generations to develop through trial and error. This observation has led to an alternative hypothesis. Perhaps the Nabataeans didn't invent their water management techniques. Perhaps they inherited them, adopted and adapted systems that were already ancient when the first Nabataean traders settled in the region. Evidence for this theory is circumstantial but intriguing. Archaeological surveys have identified pre-Nabataean settlements in the Petra area, some dating to the Neolithic period. These were not sophisticated urban centers. Most seem to have been small villages or seasonal camps, but they existed in an environment that would have demanded water management for survival, suggesting that even these early peoples must have developed some techniques for capturing and storing rare rainfall. More provocative are certain anomalies in the water system itself. A few channels, particularly those cut deepest into the bedrock, show weathering patterns consistent with extreme age, possibly predating the Nabataean period by centuries or even millennia. If accurate, this would suggest that the Nabataeans discovered and incorporated existing infrastructure, building their more sophisticated systems atop older foundations. Who might have created these older systems? The answer, if there is one, is lost to time. The Edomites, a people mentioned in biblical texts, inhabited the region before the Nabataeans and might have possessed such knowledge. Earlier still, during the Bronze Age, trade routes crossed this area, and where there is trade, there must be water for travelers. Perhaps the knowledge was passed down, culture to culture, each adding refinements, but none remembering the original innovators. Mainstream archaeology largely rejects this hypothesis, pointing out that advanced water management systems require not just knowledge, but sustained institutional support, governments or temple organizations capable of mobilizing labor and maintaining infrastructure over generations. Small, scattered pre-Nabataean communities simply couldn't have supported such efforts. The sophistication of Petra's water system, in this view, reflects Nabataean genius applied consistently over centuries as the city grew. Yet the alternative theory persists, appealing to those who sense something uncanny in the desert, a feeling that the landscape holds layers of human history deeper than the official record acknowledges. If true, it would mean the Nabataeans were not sole inventors, but brilliant adapters, recognizing ancient wisdom and translating it into a functioning system that served a growing city. It would also raise more unsettling questions. If earlier peoples possessed such knowledge, what happened to them? Why did they fade, leaving only traces? And what else might they have known? What other techniques or understandings that vanished when their cultures did, leaving the later inhabitants to start over reinventing solutions to problems that had been solved before and forgotten. The desert keeps its secrets well. The oldest channels still carry water when it rains, still function as designed by hands that turned to dust long before Petra was imagined. Whether those hands were Nabataean or belonged to some earlier, now nameless people, the water doesn't care. It flows where the stone directs it, indifferent to the questions of those who drink. The mind, encountering Petra, registers stone, red cliffs, carved facades, rocky valleys where heat shimmers and nothing grows. The imagination peoples the ancient city with traders and priests, camels and caravans, but the landscape itself seems immutable desert then, desert now, eternally arid. Then the archaeobotanists arrived with their methods of microscopic analysis, their techniques for identifying ancient pollen grains and carbonized plant remains, and the story changed. Beneath the stone, it turned out, was green, or had been. Studies of soil samples from around Petra revealed preserved pollen from plant species that don't naturally occur in the region, species that require consistent water, fertile soil, deliberate cultivation. Grapevines, olive trees, date palms, even flowers, ornamental species brought from distant regions purely for aesthetic purposes. The chemical signatures in the soil told of irrigation, of fertilizers, of terraced gardens where the rock had been carved away to create pockets for planting. Most dramatically, excavations uncovered the remains of garden structures within the city itself, terraces built against cliff faces, held in place by retaining walls, each level carefully designed to maximize water distribution while preventing erosion. These were not simple vegetable plots for food production, though some may have served that purpose. They were gardens in the classical sense, spaces designed for beauty and leisure, for demonstrating mastery over nature, for creating oases of green in the heart of stone and sand. The effort required to create and maintain such gardens in this environment is almost incomprehensible. Every drop of water had to be managed with precision. Soil had to be imported. The native substrate is mostly sandy, poorly suited for most cultivated plants. Shade structures may have been necessary to protect delicate species from the brutal desert sun. And all of this required labor, expertise, ongoing care from gardeners who understood not just horticulture, but the specific challenges of making plants thrive where they had no business surviving. Why? Why expend such effort on ornamental gardens when those same resources could have been devoted to more practical purposes? The answer speaks to something fundamental about human nature, about the relationship between wealth and display, between power and beauty. The Nabataean elite didn't just want to survive the desert. They wanted to defeat it symbolically, to create something so improbable that its mere existence became a statement. We are so powerful that we can make roses bloom on rock. There's a parallel here with the great gardens of other ancient civilizations. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, legendary for their impossible beauty in an arid land. The rooftop gardens of Rome, the elaborate water features and planted courtyards of Islamic architecture. Gardens have always been more than agriculture. They are art, theology, political statement encoded in soil and water and living things. The gardens of Petra are gone now, returned to dust. The species that once grew there are extinct locally. Their lineages continued perhaps in other lands, descended from cuttings and seeds carried by traders who never knew their ultimate origin. But the terraces remain, carved into cliffs, empty now, but still bearing witness to the ambition they represented. In the end, the gardens may be the most human thing about Petra. The water systems are impressive engineering. The architecture is stunning art. But the gardens were pure defiance. The insistence that beauty can exist anywhere, that even stone can bloom if will and skill are sufficient. For a few centuries, the impossible was routine in Petra. Even the rocks, it seems, were not immune to transformation. Archaeoacoustics, the study of sound in archaeological contexts, is a relatively new field. emerging only in the last few decades as researchers began to take seriously the role of sound in ancient religious and social experiences. Petra has become a focal point for such research, and the findings challenge assumptions about the builder's intentions and knowledge. Certain chambers within Petra's carved structures exhibit acoustic properties that seem too refined to be accidental. The theater, for instance, shows excellent sound propagation. A speaker at the stage can be heard clearly throughout the audience space without amplification, despite the structure being open to the sky and subject to ambient noise from wind and other sources. Roman theaters show similar properties, but they were designed with acoustics in mind, incorporating principles developed over centuries of theatrical tradition. Did the Nabataeans independently develop such knowledge, or were they working from Hellenistic models they encountered through trade contacts? More puzzling are the tomb chambers. Several of the larger burial sites contain spaces where sound behaves strangely. Certain frequencies are amplified, while others are dampened. In at least one chamber, researchers recorded harmonic resonances at frequencies around 110 Hz, near the lower range of human hearing, but within the range that studies have shown can induce altered states of consciousness, feelings of awe or unease, sensations that in religious contexts might be interpreted as the presence of the divine. Was this intentional? Did the Nabataeans understand that carving a chamber to specific dimensions, with walls at particular angles, would create these acoustic effects? Or did they discover the properties by accident and then incorporate them into ritual practices, interpreting the strange sounds as evidence that the space was sacred? Some researchers have gone further, testing the acoustic properties while recreating possible ancient rituals. Drumming at specific rhythms in certain chambers creates standing waves, auditory phenomena where the sound seems to become three-dimensional, emanating from no single source but filling the entire space. Chanting in groups produces interference patterns that can generate subsonic frequency sounds below the threshold of conscious hearing, but capable of affecting human physiology, causing sensations of vibration in the chest, mild disorientation, emotional intensity. The implications are provocative. If the Nabataeans deliberately engineered these effects, it suggests a sophisticated understanding of sound's psychological impact. They were, in essence, using physics to engineer religious experience. The worshippers entering these spaces wouldn't have understood the mechanism, but they would have felt the effects. The sense that something beyond the ordinary was present, that the divine inhabited these carved stones in tangible ways. Critics point out that interpretation is being layered onto ambiguous evidence. Ancient builders carved spaces for practical reasons: structural stability, available rock formations, traditional architectural patterns. That some of these spaces happen to have interesting acoustic properties might be coincidence, the result of mathematics and geology intersecting in ways the builders never intended or understood. Yet the counter-argument is equally compelling. The Nabataeans demonstrated sophisticated engineering in water systems, in architecture, in urban planning. Why assume they were ignorant of acoustics? Sound was crucial to their culture. Religious ceremonies would have involved chanting, music, oratory. It would be stranger if they didn't pay attention to how their carved spaces affected sound. Stranger still if they didn't attempt to design spaces that enhance the auditory experience of rituals. The question, as always, comes down to intent. We can measure the acoustic properties of Petra's chambers. We can record the frequencies, map the resonances, reproduce the effects. What we cannot access is the mind of the designers, their understanding of what they were creating, the theories or traditions that guided their carving. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The spaces exist, the sounds occur. When researchers play drums in those chambers, when they chant in harmonies that the stone amplifies and transforms, something happens not supernatural, perhaps, but certainly powerful. The rock sings, as travelers claimed millennia ago. And in that singing, we hear an echo of how the Nabataeans might have experienced their own sacred spaces. as places where the boundary between matter and spirit grew thin, where stone became voice, where the divine whispered through the physics of sound bouncing off carved walls. The Nabataeans are remembered as desert people, masters of sand and stone, their caravans trekking across arid wastes between Arabia Felix and the Mediterranean. But this image, while accurate, is incomplete. The Nabataeans were also sailors, their ships plying the Red Sea, and evidence suggests venturing far beyond. At the northern terminus of the Gulf of Aqaba stood a city, Ayla, now modern Aqaba, in Jordan. This was Nabataean territory, their only seaport, and through it flowed maritime trade that complemented the overland caravan routes. Ships laden with goods from Egypt, from the Arabian coast, from ports along the East African shore docked at Ayla, their cargoes transferred to caravans heading inland to Petra and beyond. But the Nabataeans were not merely middlemen in others' maritime trade. Evidence suggests they operated their own fleet, their ships venturing south along the Arabian coast and west across the Red Sea toward Egypt. Some researchers argue for Nabataean trading posts as far south as Yemen, as far west as the Egyptian coast near modern Port Bernice. If true, this would make the Nabataean commercial network one of the most extensive in the ancient world, a web of connections spanning from the Mediterranean to the approaches of the Indian Ocean. The evidence is fragmentary Nabataean inscriptions found at remote coastal sites, pottery characteristic of Petra, discovered in port excavations, references in Greek and Roman sources to Arabian ships that might have been Nabataean. But taken together, the fragments suggest a picture of a people more versatile than usually portrayed, not just desert traders, but mariners, comfortable with navigation by stars, with the moods of the sea, with the different challenges of water versus sand. Why has this maritime dimension been overlooked? Partly because Petra itself, the capital and most visible legacy, is inland, focused on the overland routes that made it wealthy. The maritime trade, while significant, was secondary to the caravan traffic. And partly because the evidence from ancient ports is harder to interpret than the massive stone monuments of Petra, a few potsherds and faded inscriptions versus facades that soar dozens of meters high. But there's a certain logic to a Nabataean maritime empire. These were people who understood trade, who thrived by connecting distant markets. Why would they limit themselves to land routes when ships could move larger cargoes more efficiently across the Red Sea? The same organizational skills that maintain desert way stations could surely manage ports and fleets. Moreover, maritime trade would have provided diversification, reducing dependence on the single corridor of overland routes that could be disrupted by drought, by political instability in neighboring regions, by competition from rival trading peoples. A kingdom that controlled both land and sea routes would be far more resilient, far better positioned to adapt to changing conditions. Some alternative researchers push the speculation further. If Nabataean ships reached Yemen and the mouth of the Red Sea, might they have continued into the Indian Ocean? Could Nabataean traders have reached the Malabar coast of India, the source of pepper and precious stones? The mainstream view is skeptical such voyages would have been extraordinarily difficult, and there's no clear evidence of Nabataean presence in the Indian Ocean. But fragments exist, certain types of incense found in Petra that didn't originate in Arabia, suggesting trade connections that reached beyond the Middle East. Was this trade conducted via intermediaries, or did Nabataean ships sail the monsoon routes themselves? The question remains open. The sea, like the desert, guards its secrets well. Shipwrecks from the Nabataean period are rare, and even when found, proving Nabataean ownership versus simply Nabataean cargo is difficult. The ports have been built over, layer upon layer, or eroded by centuries of waves and coastal change. What seems certain is that the Nabataeans understood something fundamental. Wealth flows along networks, and the more extensive and diverse those networks, the more resilient the economy. They wove a web across the ancient world, threads of trade connecting desert to sea, east to west, north to south. Petra was the spider at the center of that web, feeling every vibration, every movement of goods and information along the strands. And when the web finally broke, when the roots shifted and the connections frayed, Petra, for all its stone permanence, could not survive. The desert remained, as it always had. But the people who had mastered it dispersed, following new routes, new opportunities, leaving behind monuments that testified to what they achieved, but not to where they went when achievement was no longer possible. The sea still moves, tides still rise and fall along the Gulf of Aqaba. Waves still break where Nabataean ships once loaded cargo. But the ships are gone, their timbers rotted to nothing, their journeys forgotten. Only the stones at Petra endure, landlocked and silent about the maritime empire that once extended from their carved facades to horizons far beyond the desert's edge. Dig beneath the Nabataean levels at Petra, push through the layers of occupation and construction that date to the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, and something else appears. Older structures, cruder in execution, but unmistakably human in origin. Evidence of settlement predating the Nabataeans by centuries, perhaps millennia. These pre-Nabataean layers have attracted less attention than the spectacular carved facades above them, but their existence raises questions that go to the heart of Petra's identity. Was this site chosen by the Nabataeans because it was empty, virgin territory ideally suited to their needs? Or did they recognize something already present, infrastructure, or sacred significance that drew human activity to this particular valley long before Nabataea existed? The earliest evidence of human presence dates to the Neolithic period 10,000 years ago, or more. These were not urban dwellers, but hunter-gatherers, possibly semi-nomadic groups who used the Petra Valley as a seasonal camp. The archaeological record from this period is thin scattered stone tools, hearth remains, little else. But it establishes continuous or recurring human presence in the region across millennia, suggesting that the advantages of the location, water availability, defensible terrain, position relative to trade routes, were recognized by the most ancient inhabitants. Later layers reveal more substantial occupation. Bronze Age settlements, small but permanent, showing evidence of agriculture and animal husbandry. Iron Age structures that might have been associated with the Edomites, the biblical people who inhabited the region before the Nabataeans arrived from the Arabian interior. These settlements were modest compared to what would come later, but they were real communities. People who built homes, raised children, buried their dead in this valley. Most intriguing are certain architectural anomalies that don't fit neatly into any known cultural pattern. Circular stone structures of uncertain purpose, found in layers beneath Nabataean buildings. Carved rock features that seem too regular to be natural, but whose function is unclear. Alignment patterns that some researchers claim show awareness of astronomical phenomena, though proving intentionality is, as always, difficult. Were the Nabataeans inheritors? Did they arrive in a valley already known as significant, already modified by earlier peoples in ways that influenced later development? Mainstream archaeology suggests a simpler narrative. Small, scattered pre-Nabataean settlements existed, but they were insignificant. The Nabataeans chose the site for its natural advantages and built on a scale and with a vision entirely their own, overshadowing what came before to the point of erasure. But alternative voices suggest something more complex. They point to the sophistication of certain pre-Nabataean features, particularly water management elements that show understanding beyond what scattered communities should have possessed. They note that some of the sacred high places around Petra seem to have been used for ritual purposes before Nabataean times, suggesting religious continuity that might trace back millennia. And they ask, is it coincidence that Petra, of all locations in the vast desert, became the site of such concentrated development? Or was there something about this place, some quality or significance established long before, that drew people across ages? The evidence is insufficient for certainty. The pre-Nabataean layers are fragmentary, poorly preserved, complicated by millennia of subsequent building and rebuilding. But they exist, undeniable presences, beneath the grand Nabataean narrative, hints of stories that unfolded and concluded before history began recording such things. In a sense, Petra is a palimpsest, text written over text, the newest layer most visible, but not entirely concealing what lies beneath. The Nabataeans created magnificence, there's no question, but they created it atop foundations laid by others, in a valley that had attracted human presence since time immemorial. Were they aware of this? Did they see themselves as continuers of something ancient, or as innovators starting fresh? We cannot ask them. The stones, as always, decline to answer. But when you stand in Petra, aware that you're standing atop layer upon layer of human endeavor, it becomes harder to see the city as a singular achievement, and easier to understand it as a chapter brilliant. Certainly, but still just one chapter in a story that began long before and continues in diminished form, even now. The desert remembers, even when we forget. And beneath the sand, beneath the stone, the shadows of those who came before still linger, waiting for someone to see them. Climate is rarely stable across millennia. The landscapes we see today, however permanent they seem, are recent phenomena in geological terms. The arid deserts, the lush forests, the frozen tundras all are temporary states, constantly transitioning, responding to orbital mechanics and atmospheric chemistry and the slow chaos of Earth's systems. The region around Petra is desert now, but geological and paleoclimatic evidence suggests it wasn't always so. Core samples from lake beds, pollen preserved in sediment, speleothems from caves, these records tell of a different Arabia, one that experienced different rainfall patterns, that supported different vegetation, that might have been fundamentally more hospitable to human civilization than the harsh environment we see today. During certain periods of the Holocene, the current geological epoch, spanning the last 11,000 years, parts of Arabia experienced what researchers call humid phases. Rainfall increased, perhaps dramatically. Rivers that now exist only as dry wadis flowed year-round. Lakes formed in depressions that today hold only sand. The desert bloomed, became savanna, possibly even supported scattered forests in protected valleys. The timing of these humid phases is crucial. Some occurred during the Neolithic period, which might explain the widespread evidence of human settlement across regions that today could never support permanent populations. As the climate shifted and Arabia became more arid, these settlements would have been abandoned, populations either dying out or migrating toward remaining water sources, places like the valleys around Petra, where geography and hydrology combine to provide more resilient water availability. But there's evidence of more recent humid phases as well, fluctuations within the historical period that might have affected the Nabataean civilization itself. Pollen records suggest increased moisture in the region during the later Bronze Age and early Iron Age, precisely the period when settlements around Petra were growing, when the pre-Nabataean cultures were establishing their presence. Did they thrive because the climate temporarily allowed it? And as conditions dried again, did the knowledge they developed for managing water in good times become crucial for survival when rainfall declined? Some researchers push the speculation further. What if there were earlier civilizations in Arabia, people who thrived during ancient humid phases, who developed sophisticated cultures that we know nothing about, because when the climate shifted back to arid conditions, their cities were buried beneath advancing dunes? The Arabian desert is vast, much of it still unexplored archaeologically. If there were Bronze Age or even earlier civilizations in regions now inaccessible due to harsh conditions, we might never find them, the evidence consumed by sand and time. This hypothesis remains speculative, hovering at the edge of mainstream acceptance. But it is grounded in solid climatological evidence. Arabia has oscillated between relatively humid and extremely arid conditions many times. And where there is water in sufficient quantity, humans settle, build, develop complexity. The question is not whether such settlements could have existed, but whether any evidence survives. For Petra and the Nabataeans, the climatic context adds layers to the story. They rose during a period of relative stability, but they built infrastructure designed to capture and maximize every drop of rare water, suggesting they understood scarcity, that they were either adapting to drying conditions or remembering lessons learned during harder times. Their engineering might not have been innovation from zero, but rather the culmination of knowledge, accumulated across generations, possibly centuries, as people learned to do more with less. And their decline, while usually attributed to economic factors, the shift in trade routes, Roman competition, might have been exacerbated by climatic stress. If rainfall declined during the Roman period, even slightly, the carrying capacity of the region would have decreased. A city that could support 20,000 during good years might struggle to support 10,000 when conditions worsened. Economic decline and environmental stress could have reinforced each other, creating a downward spiral that made abandonment inevitable. The desert today reveals little of these changes. The stone cliffs look as they might have looked 1,000,000 years ago, geologically speaking. But the desert is dynamic, responsive to forces that operate on timescales humans struggle to perceive. The Nabataeans thrived briefly, a few centuries in a story spanning millennia. Before them, others thrived and faded. After them, new patterns emerged, new adaptations to the eternal challenge of extracting life from aridity. The desert remembers rain, encoded in sediment layers and cave formations, in the weathering patterns on ancient rocks. It remembers when it was green, when rivers flowed, when civilizations rose on moisture that has since evaporated into legend. And perhaps, in some future humid phase, when the rains return and the wadis flow again, new peoples will thrive where Petra stands, and they will wonder at the stone faces carved by people whose names they cannot know, in a time they cannot imagine. The climate cycles. The desert blooms and dies and blooms again. Only the stone endures, witness to transformations we're only beginning to understand. In the religious imagination of ancient peoples, the boundary between earth and sky was permeable. Gods dwelt in the heavens, but made their presence known through phenomena that touched the ground: lightning, rainbows, and perhaps most dramatically, the fall of stones from the sky. Meteorites have fascinated humans since the dawn of consciousness. They arrive with light and sound, fire trailing across the night, impact that shakes the ground. And what remains is metal or stone that doesn't resemble anything earthly, materials that seem to belong to another realm. Is it any wonder that ancient cultures often treated meteorites as sacred, as physical proof of divine interest in human affairs? The Nabataeans worshipped Dushara, a god represented by a black stone. No carved image, no anthropomorphic statue, just a rectangular block of dark, unworked rock. What was this stone? Where did it come from? The assumption has usually been that it was a natural rock formation, perhaps basalt or another dark volcanic stone common in the region, chosen for its color and symbolic weight. But some researchers have proposed an alternative. What if the sacred Batil of Dushara was a meteorite? What if the Nabataean supreme deity was represented by a literal fragment of the heavens, a piece of star matter that fell to earth and was recognized as holy? The idea is speculative but not absurd. Meteoritic iron, when weathered, can appear black or dark brown. Its density is greater than terrestrial rock, giving it an unusual, almost uncanny weight. And if witnessed falling, if a Nabataean caravan or settlement saw the fireball descend, heard the impact, found the warm stone buried in sand, the interpretation as divine gift or manifestation would be immediate and overwhelming. Cultures across the ancient world venerated meteorites. The Kaaba in Mecca contains a black stone that some researchers believe may be meteoritic in origin, though this remains unproven. Ancient Egyptian jewelry incorporated meteoritic iron, The famous sword of Tutankhamun was forged from metal that analysis has confirmed came from a meteorite. The practice of treating sky stones as sacred was widespread, suggesting deep-rooted human recognition of meteorites as special, as connected to forces beyond the terrestrial. If Dushara's betil was indeed meteoritic, it would explain certain aspects of Nabataean religion. The emphasis on the stone itself, rather than a carved representation. The sense that the god was already present in the material, rather than requiring human art to manifest. The association with mountains and storms. Meteorites are celestial, but arrive through atmospheric violence, a union of sky and earth. It would also add depth to Nabataean astronomical interests. A people who worship sky stones might be particularly attentive to celestial phenomena, might develop sophisticated observation practices, trying to understand the movements of objects that could fall from the heavens. The alignments in their architecture, the possible astronomical orientations, these might reflect not just calendar keeping, but genuine theological astronomy, the study of the sky as the realm from which their god's physical form had descended. Proving this hypothesis is nearly impossible. The original bitils are lost, destroyed or hidden, or eroded to nothing over the centuries. Chemical analysis could determine if a stone were meteoritic, but without the original object, speculation remains speculation. Some researchers have searched for meteorite impact craters in the region, reasoning that a large fall might have created a sacred site. But the desert is vast, and impact craters, especially from smaller objects, erode quickly in geological terms. Yet the idea persists, attractive in its elegance. The Nabataeans, masters of desert and stone, worshipping a god represented by stone from beyond the desert, from beyond earth itself, fire falling from the heavens, bearing divine presence in material form. The god who was the mountain but came from the stars, a paradox resolved by understanding that stone, whether earthly or celestial, is eternal in ways flesh can never be. Perhaps it doesn't require proof. Perhaps the poetry of the idea is sufficient, that ancient people, looking up at the stars they navigated by, recognized kinship between the stone they carved and the stone that fell from above. Both endure, both witness. Both connect earth to something larger, something that transcends the brief flicker of human life. The stars still burn above Petra, and somewhere in the desert, perhaps fragments of the sky still rest where they fell millennia ago, sacred to no one now, but once representing divinity made touchable, made real. Among the hundreds of tombs carved into Petra's cliffs, most are now dark, empty, silent. But one has developed a peculiar reputation among photographers and nocturnal visitors. It glows. Not brightly, the effect is subtle, requiring darkness and time for the eyes to adjust. But under certain conditions, usually on moonless nights, when ambient light is minimal, the interior walls of this particular tomb emit a faint, ghostly bioluminescence, a soft blue-green glow that seems to emanate from the stone itself. The effect was known to local Bedouin for generations, though their explanations varied. Some said the dead were restless, their spirits manifesting as light. Others claimed the tomb had been used for unholy purposes, cursed by ancient priests, the glow a warning to stay away. Still others offered more mundane interpretations. Phosphorescent minerals in the stone, activated by the sun during the day and releasing light slowly after dark. The last explanation turned out to be closest to the truth. When researchers finally analyzed the phenomenon systematically, they discovered that certain mineral salts present in this particular section of sandstone naturally occurring compounds of phosphorus and rare earth elements do indeed absorb energy from sunlight and emit it slowly as visible light, a process called phosphorescence. The effect is rare because the mineral composition has to be just right, the crystal structure properly aligned, the concentration sufficient. Most of Petra's stone doesn't contain these elements in the necessary quantities or arrangements. But in this one tomb, carved into a section of cliff, where geological processes created unusual mineral deposition. The conditions align. The result is stone that remembers light, holds it, releases it gradually through the night like a slow exhalation. Did the Nabataeans know? When they carved this particular tomb, and it's a significant one, large and elaborately decorated, suggesting it was meant for someone of importance, were they aware of the stone's unusual property? Or did they discover it afterward? The first night, someone visited the completed tomb in darkness and saw the walls glowing softly and interpreted it as divine confirmation, proof that the deceased was blessed, that this space was truly sacred? We cannot know. But the human response to such a discovery is predictable. Wonder, followed by meaning-making. In a culture that saw divinity in stone, that worshipped a god represented by uncarved rock, a tomb that glowed in darkness would surely have been seen as more than geological accident. It would have been sign, omen, evidence of the sacred inhabiting the material world. Today, visitors occasionally camp near the tomb, hoping to see the effect. It's not always visible. Cloud cover can provide too much ambient light, or the stone may not have absorbed sufficient energy during the day if conditions were overcast. But when it does appear, the experience is genuinely eerie. The glow is just strong enough to reveal the carved details of the wall's decorative patterns, architectural elements, but not bright enough to seem technological. It's organic, natural, yet otherworldly. There's poetry in this. The Nabataeans carved their tombs with extraordinary care, creating beauty meant to last forever, monuments to individuals whose names are now largely forgotten. And in at least this one case, the stone itself became part of the memorial, not just reflecting light, but generating it, keeping a faint vigil through the centuries, glowing softly in the darkness, as if the dead still breathe light, as locals once whispered. The effect will eventually fade, the minerals will degrade, the crystal structures will collapse, the slow decay of entropy will silence even this luminescence. But for now, on the right nights, under the right conditions, the tomb still performs its ancient function, marking presence, denying oblivion, insisting through a whisper of light that something of what was built here endures. Even the stones, it seems, remember life. The hypothesis has been building through earlier chapters, accumulating evidence like sediment in a wadi, until it demands direct consideration. Were the Nabataeans systematic astronomers? And if so, how sophisticated was their knowledge? Begin with the alignments. The monastery, Ad-Dir, faces almost precisely east, positioned so that on the equinoxes, the 2 days each year, when day and night are equal, the rising sun floods directly through the entrance. The effect is dramatic, transforming the interior from shadow to golden light in moments. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the precision is striking. Al-Khazna, the Treasury, shows different but equally intriguing alignments. Its facade faces east-southeast, not quite equinox sunrise, but aligned instead toward the position of winter solstice sunrise. On the shortest day of the year, the first light touches the upper portions of the facade, slowly descending as the sun rises, eventually illuminating the entire structure. The symbolic resonance is powerful. Light returning, days beginning to lengthen again, renewal after the darkest time. The high places, mountaintop sanctuaries scattered around Petra often provide clear horizon views in cardinal directions. Researchers have noted that from several of these sites, specific stars would have risen at specific times of year in the ancient past, accounting for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes which stars appear where over centuries. Sirius, the brightest star in the sky and of enormous importance to many ancient cultures, would have been particularly prominent. Some researchers claim that certain high places were positioned specifically to observe Sirius's heliacal rising, its first appearance in the dawn sky after a period of being too close to the sun to see. Venus, the morning and evening star, might also have been significant. Al-Uzza, the Nabataean goddess, was associated with stellar phenomena, and Venus is the most obvious celestial body to connect with a goddess of fertility and power. Its movements are complex but predictable, cycling through phases and positions on an 8-year pattern. Did the Nabataeans track this? Did their religious calendar incorporate Venus cycles? The evidence is circumstantial but accumulating. In addition to structural alignments, there are carved symbols that might represent astronomical phenomena, star patterns, solar symbols, possible representations of phases of the moon. And there are the practical considerations. The Nabataeans were traders who crossed deserts where celestial navigation was essential. You don't spend generations navigating by stars without developing deep understanding of their movements. The question is whether that practical knowledge evolved into systematic astronomy, into record keeping and prediction, into what we might recognize as science rather than just applied skill. Mainstream archaeology proceeds cautiously. Alignments can be coincidental, and when dealing with structures built over centuries, evolving in design, it's difficult to prove original intent. Symbol interpretation is subjective. What looks like a star map to one researcher might be purely decorative to another. Without written records explicitly describing astronomical observations or theories, certainty is impossible. Yet the pattern suggests something more than accident. The Nabataeans demonstrated sophisticated engineering, complex organizational skills, the ability to plan and execute projects requiring precise measurement and coordination. Why assume they applied this sophistication to water systems and architecture, but ignored the sky, despite its obvious importance to their livelihood and religion? Alternative researchers go further, proposing that Petra was designed as a kind of terrestrial mirror of the heavens, its layout and major structures positioned to reflect significant stars and constellations. This theory, while intriguing, lacks strong evidence. The city's layout seems more influenced by topography and practical considerations than by astronomical symbolism. But the idea captures something real, a sense that the Nabataeans saw continuity between earth and sky, that they built their civilization at the intersection of stone and star. Perhaps the truth is intermediate. The Nabataeans were practical astronomers, navigators, and calendar keepers who understood the sky well enough for their purposes. Some of this knowledge was encoded in their architecture. The alignments were deliberate, serving both practical functions, marking seasons, times for festivals, and symbolic ones, connecting sacred spaces to cosmic order. But they may not have been theoretical astronomers in the way the Babylonians or later Greeks were, developing mathematical models and attempting to explain, rather than just predict, celestial movements. The sky above Petra is extraordinary minimal light pollution, clear air, the Milky Way blazing across the heavens on moonless nights. To people who spent nights in the desert, that sky was intimate, familiar in ways modern humans can barely imagine. The stars were not distant abstractions, but companions, guides, the visible framework of cosmic order. Building their capital city, their sacred center, the Nabataeans would naturally have sought to align it with that framework, to make the earthly reflect the celestial. Whether that makes them astronomers in the formal sense might be less important than recognizing that they lived in a universe where earth and sky were continuous, where the stone they carved and the stars they navigated by were parts of a single interconnected reality. Petra stands at that intersection, its facades facing the horizon where sun and stars rise, its high places reaching toward the realm their gods inhabited. The stars still turn above those empty facades, patient and eternal. And the stone, for its part, maintains its vigil, aligned as it was 2,000 years ago, still catching the light at precise moments, still fulfilling purposes its carvers intended, even if we can no longer fully articulate them. Every civilization's end is a story of decline, transformation, or catastrophe. For the Nabataeans, the ending was slow of fading rather than a collapse, a gradual diminishment that left no dramatic climax for historians to point to and declare, "Here, this is when they ended." The mainstream narrative is economic. The incense trade declined as maritime routes became more efficient, bypassing the overland corridors the Nabataeans controlled. Roman merchants learned to navigate the Red Sea, sailing directly from Egypt to Arabia and beyond, eliminating the need for desert caravans and the fees charged for safe passage. Demand shifted as Christianity spread, and the elaborate funeral rites requiring vast quantities of incense became less common. The sources of Nabataean wealth dried up, slowly but inexorably. Political factors compounded economic decline. After Roman annexation in 106 CE, Petra lost autonomy. Decisions about trade policy, infrastructure investment, military protection were made in distant capitals by administrators whose priorities lay elsewhere. New roads were built connecting Roman provinces more efficiently, but these roads bypassed Petra, directing traffic to coastal cities like Ayla or north to Damascus and Palmyra. Environmental stress might have played a role as well. If rainfall declined during the Roman period and paleoclimatic evidence suggests some aridification maintaining, Petra's population would have become more difficult. The sophisticated water systems required constant maintenance, and as economic vitality declined, so did the institutional capacity to sustain that maintenance. A vicious cycle. Declining population meant less labor for upkeep. Deteriorating systems made the city less livable, hastening further population loss. Earthquakes delivered periodic blows. The region is seismically active, and several major quakes struck during the Byzantine period. Structures damaged by tremors went unrepaired when resources were scarce and priorities had shifted. The carved facades are resilient. They flex with the rock itself, but the built structures, the buildings that stood in front of the facades, were vulnerable. As these collapsed, parts of the city became unusable. By the early Islamic period, Petra was essentially abandoned as a major settlement. A small population persisted, probably Bedouin tribes using the caves and tombs as seasonal shelter, but the city as a functioning urban center was gone. Frankincense caravans still crossed the desert, but they took different routes. Trade still flowed between Arabia and the Mediterranean, but through different ports and different hands. The Nabataean network had been replaced. This is the standard account, and it's likely accurate as far as it goes. But it leaves a question. Where did the Nabataeans themselves go? Not the city, but the people. What happened to them? Some dissolved into the broader Roman and later Byzantine population of the region. The elite moved to cities where opportunities existed: Damascus, Cheresh, even Rome itself, if they had sufficient wealth and connections. They adopted new languages, new customs, new identities, until within a few generations, their Nabataean ancestry was a forgotten detail. The common people probably remained in the region, but adapted to new circumstances. Sedentary urban dwellers returned to semi-nomadic pastoralism, following herds and patterns that had existed before Petra rose and would continue after it fell. Their skills, water management, desert navigation, trading networks were still valuable, just applied in different contexts. But alternative theories suggest something more intriguing. Some researchers point to cultural continuities between Nabataean practices and early Arabian traditions that eventually coalesced into classical Arab culture. The Nabataean alphabet evolved into Arabic script. Certain religious practices, certain architectural styles, certain social structures persisted. Perhaps the Nabataeans didn't vanish, but transformed, becoming one of the constituent elements of the broader Arab identity that emerged in the centuries following Islam's rise. This view sees the end of Nabataea not as disappearance, but as diffusion. The specific political entity dissolved, but the people and their culture spread, adapted, contributed to the region's evolving identity. The Nabataeans, in this interpretation, are ancestral to modern Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Palestine. Their genes and cultural DNA persist even if the name has been forgotten. There's a certain poetry to this idea, a people who thrived by connecting different cultures, by serving as intermediaries, ultimately became so successful at integration that they integrated themselves out of distinct existence. They became the connections rather than the connectors, the relationships rather than the actors, an invisible matrix binding together the cultures that succeeded them. The truth, as always, is probably complex. Some Nabataeans surely died out lineages that failed to adapt, families that clung to Petra too long and perished in the declining city. Others assimilated completely into Ramang and later cultures. Still others retained some distinct identity for generations, slowly blending into the Arabian populations around them, contributing their knowledge and traditions to the emerging synthesis that would become classical Arab civilization. No single moment marks their end. They faded like the light at dusk, slowly enough that no one could point to the instant when day became night. And perhaps that's fitting for a people who built in stone, but moved like water, who created magnificence, but left almost no words. They arrived from the desert, thrived in the canyons, and when their time passed, they returned to the desert not as corpses, but as memory, as genetic and cultural traces that persist even now if you know how to look. The stone faces they carved outlasted them. The facades still stand, more permanent than the people who made them, but permanence is relative. Even stone erodes, even time. Perhaps the Nabataeans understood this, understood that survival comes not through monumental resistance to change, but through adaptation, through maintaining essence while transforming form. They vanished, but did they end? Or did they become something else? Something that survives in ways we haven't fully recognized? The desert, as always, offers no definitive answer. Only silence and the wind and stone faces that watch horizons their carvers will never see. There is a particular quality to the light at Petra in the hour before sunset. The day's heat begins to relent, and the stone, which had been bleached almost white under the midday sun, regains its color-soft pink, deepening to rose and crimson, then the deep red that gave the city its famous epithet. Shadows lengthen in the carved recesses, giving depth and drama to facades that in flat light might seem two-dimensional. Stand in the central valley at this hour, surrounded by carved cliffs, and you can almost hear the place breathe. Not literally, though the wind does move through the canyons with a sound that might be mistaken for breath, but metaphorically, as if the city itself were alive, aware, dreaming ancient dreams in stone. What were the Nabataeans? This has been the question animating our journey through their history, their engineering, their art, their mysteries. And now, at the end, the question remains, not quite answered, because perhaps it cannot be fully answered. The evidence is fragmentary, the written record nearly silent, the people themselves long gone. We are left with stone and speculation, with facts and poetry, with what we know and what we imagine. The facts, they were traders who became builders, nomads who settled, merchants who created architectural masterpieces. They mastered water in the desert, controlled crucial trade routes for centuries, synthesized influences from Arabia, Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia into something distinctly their own. They left almost no written record, but carved monuments that endure 2 millennia later. They worshipped gods of stone and star, aligned their temples with celestial movements, created acoustic spaces that amplified human voice and ritual. They flourished from roughly the 4th century BCE until the 2nd century CE, when their political independence ended and their economic importance declined. By the early Islamic period, they had vanished as a distinct people, their city abandoned to sand and silence. Those are the facts, or as close as we can come. But facts alone don't capture the essence of a civilization, the particular flavor of their culture, the questions that haunted them, the dreams that motivated their extraordinary efforts. For that, we need speculation, controlled imagination, the willingness to look at stone and see beyond it. Were they dreamers? Perhaps. The improbability of Petra suggests vision that transcended practical calculation. Yes, the location was strategically valuable, the water management technically impressive. But the beauty, the sheer aesthetic achievement, goes beyond necessity. They could have carved simple, functional spaces. Instead, they created architecture that makes modern visitors weep with its beauty. That speaks of a culture that valued art as much as commerce, that believed permanence could be achieved through making something so beautiful that even time would hesitate to destroy it. Were they memory keepers of an older world? The alternative theories we've explored suggest this possibility, that they inherited knowledge from earlier peoples, that the sophistication of their water systems, their possible astronomical knowledge, their choice of Petra as a site, all built on foundations laid by cultures now lost to history. If true, this would make them translators as much as innovators, people who recognized ancient wisdom and adapted it to new circumstances, preserving it in stone when it might otherwise have been forgotten. The circular stones beneath their buildings, the pre-Nabataean settlements, the hints of climatic shifts that brought and then destroyed earlier Arabian civilizations, all suggest a landscape layered with human endeavor, far deeper than the visible record shows. The Nabataeans may have been the final flowering, the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about surviving and even thriving in one of Earth's harshest environments. Or perhaps they were simply practical people, extraordinarily skilled at their particular niche, desert trade and engineering, who have been romanticized by distance and mystery. Perhaps there were no grand visions, no cosmic alignments beyond basic calendar keeping, no inherited ancient wisdom. Perhaps they succeeded through hard work, organizational skill, and fortunate timing. And when circumstances changed, they adapted or dispersed like any sensible people would. The stone faces offer no judgment, favor no interpretation. They stand as they were carved, beautiful and silent, allowing us to project onto them whatever narrative we need. And perhaps that's their final gift, not just the aesthetic pleasure of the architecture itself, but the space they provide for imagination, for questioning, for that peculiar human need to connect with the past, even when the past refuses to fully reveal itself. Today, Petra draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. They walk the sick, emerge before Al-Khazna, gasp appropriately, take photos, climb to the monastery, explore the tombs and high places. Most will learn the basic facts: Nabataeans, trade routes, carved in rock. Some will go deeper, will read the theories and speculations, will stand in the acoustically resonant chambers or watch the equinox sunrise and wonder about intentionality and meaning. The city accepts them all, ancient hospitality extended into the modern age. It doesn't insist on understanding, doesn't demand that visitors solve its mysteries. It offers itself as it is: stone and silence, beauty and enigma, and allows each person to take from it what they will. And when the tourists leave, when the site closes and darkness fills the canyons, Petra returns to itself. The facades glow softly in moonlight, shift through their spectrum of reds and pinks and ambers. The wind moves through carved spaces, creating sounds that might be music or might be simple physics. The stones that glow faintly in the darkness maintain their vigil. The alignments continue to function, the sun rising at the equinoxes exactly where it rose 2,000 years ago, indifferent to whether anyone is watching. The Red City dreams again, or perhaps still. Dreams of caravans and incense, of cisterns brimming with rainwater, of temples where priests invoked Dushara and Al-Yuza. Dreams of a people who came from the desert and returned to it, leaving behind only these stone testimonies to ambition and beauty and the human drive to create meaning in a world that offers none inherently. Were the Nabataeans successful? By the usual measures, longevity, cultural continuity, historical influence, their success was limited. They lasted a few centuries, left minimal written legacy, were absorbed by larger empires. But by another measure, the ability to create beauty that endures, to make something so remarkable that 2,000 years later, people cross the world to stand before it in wonder. Their success is absolute. The desert wind whispers through the sick, carrying with it scents of sand and time. Somewhere in those whispers, perhaps, are the voices of those who carved these faces. Their words in a language we've forgotten. Their meanings in a context we can barely reconstruct. We cannot hear them clearly. We likely never will. But we can stand before what they made and touch the stone they shaped and watch the light play across surfaces they carved. And in those moments, connection occurs imperfect, incomplete, but real. Across the gulf of centuries, across the silence of abandoned cities, across the mystery that surrounds every vanished people, something passes. Not knowledge, exactly. Not certainty. Understanding, maybe. Or at least recognition that humans have always built, always dreamed, always sought to impose meaning on stone and star and desert wind. The Nabataeans did it here, in this place, in their particular way. They succeeded magnificently for a time, then faded as all things must. But the stone remains. The Red City endures. And in enduring, it asks its questions still, invites speculation still, holds space for mystery in a world increasingly mapped and measured and explained. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything. If you've journeyed with us through these chapters, through the history and speculation and hard facts and unanswered questions that define Petra and the Nabataeans, consider staying for more explorations of the ancient world's mysteries. There are so many stories still untold, so many stones still speaking to those willing to listen. But for now, we leave Petra to its dreams. The sun sets. The stone glows its deep red farewell. And in the gathering darkness, the desert wind moves through carved canyons, carrying whispers that might be memory or might be only air. Impossible now to distinguish one from the other. The Nabataeans are gone. Petra remains. And somewhere in the space between those two facts lies everything we've sought, everything we've almost understood, everything that makes the past precious, even when, especially, when it refuses to fully explain itself. The Red City dreams again. And perhaps, in some way we cannot articulate, we dream with it.